This is the big problem in Asia that the world doesn't notice. If we look closely at the whole of Asia, the signs are very clear. Rivers that used to be full of life are now dry. Rice fields and farmlands that were once abundant in harvest are now slowly drying up. You can also notice that hydroelectric dams are stopping because there's no more water. Brownouts are happening repeatedly as well. And what's worse is that there are now long lines for food. Most faucets in many Asian countries no longer have running water. In China, water is also running out. In India, they're running short on wheat. And in Southeast Asia, people can barely handle the extreme heat. In fact, these are not separate problems. This is a single crisis that's exploding all at once. Day by day, Asia, a continent that's home to more than half of the world's population, is being destroyed. And this destruction is happening very quickly. Now, there's one important thing that's often overlooked. These are not three separate problems. Water, food, and energy are interconnected. It's like a domino effect, where everything is affected when one has a problem. In other words, when one collapses, the other two will follow. And now all three are collapsing at the same time. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It means a lot to us content creators. Thank you very much, and now let's get started. Let's start at the very root of everything, the foundation that holds the whole system together. Water. Asia is home to some of the most powerful rivers in the world. There's the Ganges, the Yangtze, and the Mekong. These rivers shaped ancient civilizations. They have given life to billions of people for thousands of years, but now they are slowly dying. In 1997, the Yellow River of China, considered the cradle of civilization for the Chinese, started to dry up. For 226 days, it was clear that the river no longer had enough water. This wasn't just a simple drought. It was a warning that human consumption is now higher than what nature can provide. And China knows that. That's why they responded with one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. And this is the South-North Water Transfer Project, a massive system of canals and pipelines stretching for hundreds of miles. Every year it transfers 10 billion cubic meters of water from the wet south to the dry north, where the river is dry. And it's obvious why they did this. Northern China, including Beijing, really doesn't have enough water for people to survive. Underneath Beijing as well, the groundwater is gradually being depleted. For many decades, it has been continuously dropping. In the early 2000s, the water level beneath the city was dropping by 1 to 2 meters each year. The city had no other choice but to shut down many wells, and as a result, they now rely solely on water brought in from distant regions, hundreds of miles away. Think about that carefully. The capital of the world's second largest economy can no longer support its own water needs. And it doesn't end there. In different parts of Asia, the same thing is happening. In Central Asia, there's the Aral Sea, which was once the fourth largest inland lake in the world, but it was destroyed by irrigation projects during the time of the Soviet Union. Back then, almost all the rivers here were diverted into the desert to sustain and grow the cotton they planted in the desert. And because of this, in just a few decades, more than 90% disappeared. The fishing villages that used to be on the shore are now miles away from the water. What used to be the seafloor has now become a toxic desert. And now the dust mixed with salt is carried by the wind, poisoning the entire region. An entire sea here has disappeared. This isn't a story from ancient times. It happened within the lifetime of people today. And it's a preview of what could happen. It could happen in other parts of Asia if water management doesn't change. And there's something even worse that can't be seen by the eyes. Underground, there's groundwater, water reservoirs that have formed over thousands of years. But now it's being extracted or taken out very quickly. India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal combined to extract more than half of all the groundwater used in the world. This means that extraction is faster than its ability to replenish. And when the groundwater runs out, it doesn't just come back easily. Once it's gone, that's it. And when the water gives out, food will follow. When food is gone, energy will collapse. And if all of them fail at the same time, chaos will follow. This is a silent crisis that is slowly destroying Asia. It's not a sudden explosion, but a gradual cracking until one day it collapses. Despite this, in Punjab, India, their water table is rapidly dropping. Every 10 years, several meters are immediately lost underground. Wells that used to be 20 feet deep now need to be dug up to 200 feet just to get enough water. And even then, there are still wells that completely dry up. Pakistan is facing the same nightmare. The Indus River Basin, which sustains the entire agricultural heartland of the country, is gradually being depleted, drawn from the surface and also sucked from underground. And when the wells dry up, there's no plan B. But overuse isn't the only problem. Even in places where there's still water, it's often no longer usable. In China, several decades of rapid industrialization have left a toxic legacy. According to government surveys, 70% of rivers and lakes are polluted. More than 1/5 of surface water is already severely contaminated. It can't be drunk and can't be used for farming either. There are rivers that are completely dead, no fish, no life, only poison flows through them. The same story is happening in India. All of its 14 major rivers are heavily polluted. In Delhi alone, more than 800 million liters of untreated sewage are dumped every day. That's not a mistake. 800 million liters every day. And this has a severe impact on the economy. In China, water shortages in cities cause about $11.2 billion in lost industrial output every year. When you include health costs due to pollution, it exceeds $15 billion every year. In India, according to projections, water demand could double the supply by 2030. This means there will be almost a 50% gap between what is needed and what is actually available. And this is where things start to get dangerous. But before we get to Georgia politics, there's another threat to water that most people hardly know about. The Himalayas. It's called the Third Pole. These mountains have the largest ice reserves in the world, aside from the Arctic and Antarctic. And now they're melting. The glaciers of the Himalayas are the source of Asia's most important rivers: the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Mekong, and Yangtze. Nearly 2 billion people in 10 countries rely on water from these glaciers. Scientists warn that by 2100, 1/3 to 2/3 of the ice in the Himalayas could disappear. In the short term, rapid melting causes floods and landslides, but in the long run, the effect of having none is even worse. During the critical months when water is most needed, the rivers gradually dry up. Communities at the foot of the mountain are already witnessing this. The current is stronger during spring because of the rapid melting. But towards the end of the year, there is suddenly a shortage because the ice that used to maintain the flow of water is gone. When Asia's water towers run out, the results will be disastrous. Less irrigation, less drinking water, less hydropower, and possibly wars between countries. And this is where we come to the powder keg. Rivers do not follow national borders. The Indus flows from India to Pakistan. The Ganges flows from India into Bangladesh. The Brahmaputra starts in China, passes through India, and ends in Bangladesh. The Mekong originates in China and winds through 5 countries in Southeast Asia. When there was still plenty of water, the agreements worked. But now that water is scarce, these agreements are slowly starting to break down. India and Pakistan, longtime rival countries, share the use of the Indus under a treaty that has been in place for decades. But as India's demand for water grows, there are already talks about renegotiation. For Pakistan, which relies on the Indus to survive, this is a threat to the very existence of the country. Downstream of the Ganges, Bangladesh quietly observes as India continues to build dams and water diversions upstream. In the 1990s, This almost led to a diplomatic crisis due to the reduction in water flow. On the Mekong, China's large dams upstream coincide with severe droughts in the downstream countries: Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. They all have the same question. Is Beijing manipulating the river? China's answer is no. But according to the data, what they say is the opposite of reality. No full-scale water wars have erupted yet, but the pressure is already intense. As countries see their valuable resources gradually disappearing, desperation takes over. And when a country becomes desperate, diplomacy is not always the first choice. There's one more important thing about water that everyone needs to understand. It's not just about drinking. It's about the life of the whole society. Hospitals need water. Factories need water. Power plants need water. But above all, farms need water. And this is where the next domino comes in, because when water is gone, harvests will fail. And when the harvest fails, society will collapse. For many decades, Asia experienced what is called the agricultural miracle, the Green Revolution. This was the time when the continent became the world's breadbasket. High-yield crops, expanded irrigation, chemical fertilizers. Everything worked, the harvest tripled. Major famines were avoided. Hundreds of millions of people rose out of poverty. But all of that came with a price. The Green Revolution was built on water, a lot of water. Today, about 35% of cultivated land in Asia is irrigated. But that land produces more than 60% of the continent's food. That means most of Asia's calories depend on artificial irrigation. If irrigation stops, more than half of the food supply will collapse, and this is even scarier. Almost half of the water taken for irrigation in Asia doesn't even reach the crops. It gets lost in broken canals through evaporation and runoff. Billions of gallons are wasted. In some old irrigation systems, the amount wasted is almost shocking. But the farmers have no other choice. They keep pumping water, they keep irrigating, because without water, nothing will grow. And now, the irrigation is stopping. In Pakistan, more than 90% of agriculture depends on the Indus River. When drought hits or the flow from upstream decreases, the harvest immediately drops. In 2022, severe floods destroyed no less than 4 million acres of farmland. In an instant, from being an exporter, it became a crisis country. The same dangerous balance exists in India. It needs to feed 1.4 billion people, even with limited water. To help the farmers, the government subsidizes electricity. That's why pumping groundwater is cheap. So they keep pumping and pumping and pumping again. India extracts about 1/4 of all the groundwater used in the entire world. Just one country accounts for 1/4 of the global total. In some places, the water table has dropped by 4 meters or even more. Wells that used to be shallow now have to be dug as deep as 200 feet. And even the deepest wells are starting to fail until they eventually dry up completely. This is where climate change comes in. In 2022, a record-breaking heat wave in March destroyed India's wheat crop just before harvest. The government immediately banned wheat exports to ensure food supply within the country. India, one of the world's largest grain exporters, was forced to halt exports to avoid running out of food. Just a year later, the monsoon became unpredictable. This affected rice production. Once again, India imposed restrictions on rice exports. Global markets panicked. This is no longer a theory. It's happening now. And China has its own nightmare. It has 20% of the world's population, but only 6% of global freshwater northern China lacks water. The south is rainier, but has less farmland. In 2022, drought devastated the Yangtze. Agriculture in the central part of the country was affected. Meanwhile, the south was flooded. Extreme weather is destroying the very thing agriculture needs: predictability. And when predictability is gone, crop yields fall. Smaller countries have less room for error. Bangladesh, for example, relies on monsoons and rivers for rice. When there's not enough rain, there's drought. When there's too much, there are devastating floods. Between those two extremes, millions of lives are at stake. In the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, one of Asia's most important rice bowls, the land is slowly giving way. The dams upstream, along with rising sea levels, are allowing salt water to seep further inland. The once fertile farmland that fed millions is turning into salty marshes. And this is why agricultural experts can't sleep at night. By 2050, the world will need to produce 56% more food calories compared to 2010 to feed the expected 10 billion people. A large part of that increased demand will come from Asia, but Asia's water is running out. The math doesn't add up. Even now, about 60% of irrigated agriculture worldwide is already under severe water stress. Most of this is in China, India, and other breadbaskets of Asia. More mouths to feed, less water, and every year the gap keeps getting bigger. Some wealthy countries have already given up. Saudi Arabia, for example, stopped growing wheat in 2016. After decades of depleting fossil aquifers, now almost all of their grains are imported. In other words, they transferred their water consumption to other countries. But this can't be done by countries like India and Bangladesh. They're too poor. They have too many people. They need to grow their own food, even though the water is gradually disappearing and it's only going to get worse. In many parts of Pakistan, India, and Central Asia, poor irrigation management has ruined the very land itself. Because of poor drainage that causes salt to accumulate in the soil, over time, once fertile farmland turns into barren land. The land itself is dying. This can't be fixed by adding more water. The damage is permanent. Experts warn that by the 2030s and 2040s, if there are no major changes in water usage, food production growth will have to stop. Exactly at the time when population and demand are at their peak. In other words, widespread hunger in the most affected areas. The United Nations reported that in 2023, nearly 470 million people in Asia experienced acute food insecurity. That's almost 500 million people, severe hunger. And that happened even before the worst climate shocks arrived. And this is what's going to happen next. When harvests keep failing repeatedly, farmers can no longer survive. The youth leave the dying villages. They flow into cities that are already overcrowded, looking for jobs that don't exist. Mega cities are swelling beyond their capacity. Slums are expanding. Tensions are rising. This is not speculation. Asia's urban population is exploding. Cities like Delhi, Karachi, and Dhaka, which already have tens of millions of residents, continue to absorb waves of migrants from the provinces. The infrastructure can't keep up. Water systems are under strain. Sanitation is collapsing. Diseases are spreading. And remember, these are not just economic migrants. They are climate refugees. They are fleeing from lands that can no longer sustain life. Bangladesh, according to projections, could produce tens of millions of climate refugees as the sea level rises and fresh water disappears from coastal areas. And where will they go? India doesn't want them. Others don't want them either. In some countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia, there's what's called a youth bulge. A huge number of young people are entering a job market that's already long been full. If you add to that the lack of food and water, you have the perfect recipe for an explosion of chaos. Young people who are unemployed, hungry, and hopeless have long been the spark for revolutions throughout history. When people can't eat, they will move. If they can't move, they will fight. History has already proven this. The high price of food and crop failures helped ignite the Arab Spring in the Middle East. There were riots, governments fell, and civil wars broke out. The civil war in Syria has many causes, but a major factor was the severe drought from 2007 to 2010 that destroyed farms, forced families to move to the cities, and created unbearable social pressure. When the conflict erupted, the lack of water and food made everything worse. Asia has not yet experienced such a widespread collapse. But all the ingredients are already there. Youth bulges in South Asia and the Middle East, millions of unemployed young people, rising food prices, water shortages, governments under pressure, and one more thing that makes it worse, inequality. In every country in Asia, the rich can protect themselves from scarcity. Deeper wells, bottled water, imported food, diesel generators when the power goes out, but the poor can't do that. Small landholding farmers, slum dwellers, nomadic communities. They will be the first to go hungry, the first to go thirsty. When survival becomes a privilege only for the rich, that's when anger starts to boil. And when one ethnic or religious group controls the resources while others do not, have nothing, the existing tension suddenly erupts into violence. All it takes is one shock, a major crop failure, a severe drought, and the powder keg will explode. But this crisis has an even harsher twist. Even if you secure water and food, there's another pillar that can collapse: energy. Asia runs on energy. Factories, cities, transportation. Modern life requires continuous and reliable electricity, and energy consumption in Asia has already exploded. By 2025, Asia is expected to consume 1/2 of all the electricity produced in the world. Half. Just China and India alone are already driving a large part of the increase in global energy demand. Industrial boom, expanding middle class, huge megacities, all of those rely on electricity. When the power goes out, everything stops. But the energy grid is more fragile than most people think. In January 2023, Pakistan experienced a nationwide blackout. More than 220 million people lost electricity for a whole day. The entire country went dark. In Central Asia, something similar happened in early 2022. A grid malfunction plunged Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan into darkness. For several hours, millions were affected. Hospitals scrambled, industries came to a halt. This was not an accident. These are warnings. And here is the connection that many often overlook. Energy and water are interconnected. Thermal power plants, coal, gas, nuclear, require massive amounts of water for cooling. When there is no water, the plant stops. Between 2017 and 2021, many power plants in India were forced to shut down because there wasn't enough fresh water for cooling. The result was a loss of 8.2 terawatt hours of electricity. That's enough to supply power to 1.5 million homes for 5 years. Hydropower is even more at risk. When there's a drought, the river flow decreases. When the flow drops, electricity generation falls. It's that simple. In 2022, Sichuan province in China, which gets 80% of its electricity from hydropower, was hit by the most severe heat wave in 60 years. Hydropower output dropped by half. Factories shut down, cities rationed electricity, people endured the heat in the dark, and this is happening more often now. Meanwhile, the heat itself is also damaging the grid. High temperatures reduce the efficiency of hydropower, power plants, and transmission lines, exactly when demand is highest because of air conditioning. It's a vicious cycle. As the weather gets hotter, people need more electricity. But as it gets hotter, the grid can do less. And as global temperatures continue to rise, this will only get worse. Some power plants have to completely shut down when the ambient temperature exceeds their limit. According to studies, by 2050, heat waves alone could cause more than $8 billion in losses each year for Asia's power sector. More than half of all weather-related power losses will come from extreme heat. And that's just from the heat, not yet counting droughts, floods, and storms that damage transmission lines and substations. Now imagine this nightmare scenario. It hits South Asia. Rivers are drying up, groundwater is running out, crops are withering. Then, because there's no water for cooling, thermal power plants shut down. Hydropower dams are idle behind reservoirs that are almost empty. The grid collapses. Suddenly, water can no longer be pumped to the cities. People line up for hours at the few public taps that still work in the intense heat of the drought. There's no air conditioning. The elderly start to die. Hospitals are struggling to keep critical patients alive using backup generators that only have enough fuel for a few days. And when that runs out, that's when the real crisis begins. You won't be able to operate the irrigation systems anymore. Some crops that survived the drought are now completely withering because farmers can no longer pump water from the wells. You won't be able to process food anymore. The cold storage won't work. Fresh food is spoiling. Meat is rotting. Supply chains are falling apart. Cities are slowly descending into chaos. Communication fails when cell towers lose power. Traffic lights go out. Looting begins. This isn't science fiction. Parts of this have already happened. On a smaller scale, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, blackouts are common during the peak of summer. In Lebanon, the country has long been trapped in a power crisis where electricity is only available for a few hours each day. The infrastructure is barely holding on. It just needs one big shock. A severe drought or a grid failure at the wrong time, and the whole system could collapse. And when the energy fails, everything else fails with it. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. 3 pillars, water, food, energy, are all interconnected. All of them are under extreme pressure, and all of them are failing at the same time. This is what systemic collapse looks like. It's not sudden, it's not dramatic, it's slow. Repeated breakdowns where each failure speeds up the next one. Drought. Water disappears. No water, no crops, and no electricity. No electricity. No water pumps and no food processing, no food. There are riots and migration. Migration. Cities are being flooded. More cities, more demand, fewer resources. And things are accelerating even more. The feedback loops have started, and this is the geopolitical reality. When resources run out, cooperation becomes more difficult. Countries are closing themselves off. Borders are hardening. Tensions are rising. India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons and a long history of conflict. They have been through several wars. In the early 2000s, they almost went to nuclear war. Now, add the water shortage to that. Both sides suspect each other of blocking the river flow. India hinted that it might reconsider the Indus Waters Treaty, an agreement that survived even through wars. For Pakistan, which relies on the Indus to survive, any reduction of water from upstream is seen as an act of war, a severe drought, a provocative dam, a miscalculation. That's all it takes. On the Mekong, the downstream countries accuse China of controlling the flow of water using dams upstream. When there is a drought, fingers are immediately pointed at Beijing. China denies this, but trust is slowly fading. Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, all of them are anxiously watching as more dams are being built. These are being built by China, and the flow of their rivers is getting weaker. Even between India and Bangladesh, who usually get along, there is simmering tension over the Ganges. In the 1990s, the water flow was greatly reduced because of India's upstream barrage, and Bangladesh almost cut off diplomatic relations. A treaty was signed, but fears remain about future water withdrawals. Populations lacking resources, wounds from history, and the continuously shrinking water supply between the countries. Cracks are spreading within the countries, the wealthy regions are hoarding, the poor are suffering. Ethnic and religious tensions intensify even more when one group controls the water or food. In India, disputes between states over river allocation have already led to protests and riots. In Iran, farmers have taken to the streets. Because of poor water management, when people become desperate, when they are thirsty, hungry, and powerless, they become unpredictable. And unpredictable populations make governments nervous. Some analysts have issued warnings. The next major wars will not be because of oil, but because of water. Water wars are still rare in history, but that's because there used to be enough water to share. When the shortage becomes severe, when lives are at stake, nothing is certain anymore. So, is Asia doomed? Not yet for sure. The direction is worrying, but it's not set in stone yet. The pressure is real. The physics of climate change is real. The math of population and resources is real. If the current trend continues, it seems almost inevitable that some parts of Asia will collapse. But the direction can still change. Policies can be adjusted. Technology can help. The question is the pace of change enough? Will countries choose cooperation over conflict? Because here's the truth. There is a solution. Water scarcity can be addressed through better management, modern irrigation, recycling, and desalination. Food security can improve through drought-resistant crops, smarter farming, and reducing waste. Energy grids can be strengthened through renewables, better storage, and more resilient infrastructure. Those are the solutions. But implementing this across so many countries with billions affected requires political will, massive investment, and genuine international cooperation. And right now, the world is moving too slowly. At the crossroads of Asia, it's a path toward adaptation. Adaptation, innovation, survival. One step closer to the collapse of the systems that sustain almost half of humanity. We can already see the cracks. Rivers dying, crops failing, grids collapsing, societies falling apart. The continent isn't completely broken yet, but it's already buckling under the weight of the pressure. And when it finally gives way, the effects won't end there. Global food prices will rise, the refugee crisis will spill over borders, and geopolitical instability will spread. This is the story of our time. The story of what happens when the most basic necessities of life, water, food, energy, become scarce. When growth and demand exceed what nature can provide, Asia built its empires on great rivers and fertile plains. Now those rivers are drying up, the plains are turning to dust, the foundation has collapsed. The question is not whether the crisis is real. It is real. The question is what happens next.